James Benson was born in Yorkshire in the late 19th century. He always had a passion for God's people and felt a strong call to be a missionary. And so, soon after the First World War, in about 1919, he and his wife Bertha arrived in Papua New Guinea. It was a new adventure for both of them, and they believed that God had called them to that country. Bertha gave birth to her first child, a son, during that time, but sadly for Bertha, the climate in Papua New Guinea was too harsh for her. And so with some sadness, after some years in Papua New Guinea, they moved south. And they came to Goulburn in New South Wales. And James became an assistant at the cathedral in Goulburn. He was much loved in the cathedral, but they couldn't get enough money to pay for his ministry. And so in 1926, the bishop arranged for him to move to a parish a bit further south. It's a place called Badalla. Bertha and James settled into this new place, and their family grew so that by 1928 there were 4 children. In October of that year, James and Bertha and the family realized that it was time to have a break, to have a holiday, and so they set off early one day to drive to Sydney. They arrived at the Clyde River. At that time there was no bridge over the Clyde River, but rather a punt that would take vehicles, carts and cars from one side of the river to the other. James saw the darkness of what he believed was the punt waiting on his side of the river and drove straight into the River Clyde. The car fell deeply into the river. James managed to escape and he came to the surface, but there was no sign of anyone else. So he dived down into the water and could find no sign of any of the family or the car. Tragically, Bertha and all 4 children died that night. For a while, James tried to make sense of what had happened. It seemed that first his going to Papua New Guinea had been a mistake, and then to go to Badalla had been a mistake, for he had suffered. And he tried to find God and to serve God in this terrible place. James went to Wagga Wagga to serve as an assistant in that town, in that parish, but it wasn't possible. It was too hard for him. And so in about 1930, he joined a religious community, the Community of the Ascension, which was based in an old house on the outskirts of Goulburn. As the years of healing came, he began to look outside of the community again and to feel that it was really important for him to do something more than just sit in prayer. He tried to persuade the other brothers to come with him, to have a mission outside of the community, but it wasn't possible. And so in the end he left. As a priest sent by the Anglican Board of Mission, he returned to Papua New Guinea. He went to a place called Guna, which is on the north coast of Papua New Guinea. When war was declared, they remained in Papua New Guinea. And when it seemed that the Japanese invaders were to come close to them, all of the missionaries in Papua New Guinea decided that they must stay rather than leave. Led by Bishop Strong, they believed that if their gospel was only for good times, then it meant nothing at all. If they abandoned the people that they believed God had called them to care for at the time of greatest danger, that would speak nothing of the truth of God's love. So they remained. James was in this small mission station with 2 others, a nurse called May Hayman, and there was also Mavis Parkinson. To begin with, they were confident that things would be well. But then the invasion got closer, and they had to flee the station as bombing began. James and the nurse and the teacher moved inland, trying to avoid the invading Japanese. They encountered a Japanese patrol. In the confusion, the two women went one way and James went another. He was ignored and the two women were captured. And that they were numbered amongst the Anglican martyrs. But James survived. And then finally he was arrested. And in the years of his captivity, he built relationship with other people in the camp and indeed also with a Japanese war correspondent for whom he later wrote an introduction to that correspondent's history of the war. James himself discovered in 1950 that May and Mavis had been murdered within hours of their capture. They were left in a rough grave. James returned to Australia at the end of the Second World War and spent some time working for ABM trying to generate funds for mission in Papua New Guinea. But it was to no avail. He was not settled. And so he returned. And once more he began to rebuild the people of God in that place. They built a martyrs' school in memory of Mavis and May and the other Anglican martyrs. In 1950, another tragedy. Mount Lamington, a volcano, erupted. The school was destroyed. And a number of the teachers and the principal killed. Once again, James was confronted by a world where somehow he continued to live and others did not. Time and again he had sought to serve the Lord and had not been able to save the lives of those who he cared for and loved. And yet there is something of James Benson's spirit which speaks not of death but of resurrection. In the cathedral at Dugura, there was above the altar a wonderful painting. It's the painting of the resurrection. And it was painted by James Benson. It's a wonderful celebration of people laughing and smiling. It's a wonderful declaration of people of all colours gathered round the risen Christ. For James Benson, each moment was not the end of the story. James Benson would have been a martyr, but the Lord would not let him die, but rather asked him to live in the midst of tragedy. And as he lived in the midst of tragedy, he actually saw hope and new life. In Papua New Guinea, even today, there are children called Benson and grandchildren called Benson in celebration of the man of God who lived with them and told stories of hope.